Order. Welcome to today's session of the Business and Trade Select Committee and the opening of our inquiry into industrial strategy. I'm absolutely delighted that all three of you have been able to join us. Thank you so much indeed for making it. I know you've had to sacrifice important visits and engagements to be with us this afternoon, and we're really grateful for that. We have got a hard stop at 3 o'clock on this panel, so we're going to whistle through the questions that we have for you as fast as we can. And if you can be as punchy as you can with the answers, that will help us cover as much territory as we can. I just want to kick off. We're going to basically go through growth forecasts, industrial strategy as a contributor to growth forecasts, and then we'll get into some of the strategic principles that you think are important. So, Professor Mazzucato, perhaps I could just start with you. The Prime Minister has set out some pretty bold ambitions about becoming the fastest growing economy in the G7. Do you think that's achievable?
Well, I don't know any country that doesn't want to have a high growth rate, so that doesn't distinguish this country. What we need to look at are the structural drivers of growth and look at them both in the past and what's being done today to affect those. So a key driver of growth are public and private sector investments. GDP, as you know, can be broken down in terms of business investment, government investment, consumer spending, net exports, and we have historically underinvested in the public sector, and we are 28th in the OECD in terms of private sector investment. So if this industrial strategy, which we'll get to in a minute, can actually catalyze public sector investment, which crowds in private sector investment, then absolutely we can increase the growth rate. But you don't get growth by talking about growth, you get it by investing in all those things that increase productivity.
Is it possible, do you think, given that analysis, do you think it is possible to get to 2.5% growth out of the UK economy in 3 years' time?
Again, if we became the coolest place to be in the world to be investing in AI, in life sciences, in actually bringing together all sorts of new services in the digital economy and the financial services to catalyze great achievements around, for example, our health objectives, reducing the digital divide, having net zero across all the different cities in the UK and all the private and public sector investments that require that, then yes.
Okay, perfect. Diane, Coyle, what's your view on?
So, short-term forecasting in such an uncertain world, very difficult, so I don't know about 2 years' time, but there's certainly the scope to increase the economy's potential growth rate over the long term. You've seen that recently the Bank of England reduced its forecast for potential growth. That, to me, is the real target, getting that potential growth rate up, because that is what drives living standards and the quality of life for people in this country over not just the next 2 years, but the next 5 and 10 years.
Given what you know about economic growth and development around the world, do you think it is possible to make the order of magnitude of change that's perhaps needed in the UK over the course of this Parliament?
Well, the opportunity for the UK and everybody is that there are extraordinary technological developments going on. And through history, it's been technology that does drive long-term productivity growth, GDP growth, but also improvements in the quality of life. And so what we're talking about today is really how do you crystallise the opportunities that those technologies afford, as well as the whole range of other policy instruments available to increase that long-term potential growth rate.
Stretching but possible is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So Charlie Mayfield, what's your view?
Well, I'm the only non-economist on this panel, so I defer to my colleagues to my left. But I would, first of all, I'd agree that investment and tech adoption are two absolutely critical drivers of growth. And if you can get those both working, then we have a chance of growing the economy significantly faster. But I would add a third really critically important aspect, which is adoption. And one of the things is there's fantastic technologies out there. There's lots of people talking about how powerful things like AI are. And there are a lot of businesses who are quite confused or unsure about just how they're going to transform their businesses. So alongside the drivers, the classical drivers of growth, investment and tech adoption, you have to think also about adoption and the behavioural aspects of any kind of growth strategy. And this applies particularly to smaller businesses. And it's always worth remembering that small and mid-sized businesses employ about 2/3 of the people who work in this country. And so most of the conversation around growth and around industrial strategy tends to overlook those key parts of the economy. And so we have to address them. And we won't achieve the growth that we would like to see if we don't include them.
Okay. Matt Weston.
Thank you, Chair. For several years we haven't had an industrial strategy in this country, and I'd be interested to hear from economists whether other countries, particularly the G7 countries, have boasted a industrial strategy over the last 5 years or so. But in your views, what sort of contribution do you think the industrial strategy could make to closing the gap in terms of our growth rate with our G7 peers? Maybe you, Mariana.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think we have had an industrial strategy for many years. It's just that there's different ways to do it. So when an industrial strategy ultimately is just about giving guarantees and subsidies and loans to particular key sectors, which maybe have lobbied their way up to be considered a key sector, as opposed to a transformational strategy that allows all sectors and asks all sectors to do their part. And especially if there are small companies that are willing to work with government around really important priorities, they should get extra help because they're small, but it's not size in and of itself. We often say don't pick winners, pick the willing. And so already back in 2018, for example, I was working with Greg Clark when he was minister in Bays around how to transform what at the time was a sector-based strategy. There was aerospace, automotive, life sciences, finance, and the creative sector towards a challenge-oriented strategy, and they chose clean growth, sustainable mobility, healthy aging, and the AI data economy. And the idea there was, if you start thinking about sustainable mobility, for example, what are all the different investments and innovations we need, not just in transport, but also in all the areas, including how we build, green cement, green steel. So really looking at challenges and missions that require multi-sectoral, cross-sectoral transformation. And I think that countries, for example, Germany, which recently have been very clear where some of their challenges are, for example, the Energiewende, what we see is that the way they've redesigned their industrial strategy has indeed been catalytic. Why? It means that their public bank, the KfW, when they provided loans to sectors like the steel sector, were conditional that that sector do its part towards that challenge around the kind of sustainable energy mission. And that meant that the sector had to invest in repurpose, reuse, recycle technology across the whole supply chain in order to get a public loan. Whereas what we've seen in this country, I think for many years, is kind of a one-way relationship where sectors receive support without necessarily there being conditions in what's required in terms of the investment and innovation.
Thank you. Cool. Any comments?
I think of industrial policy as referring to all the tools governments have available to affect the supply side structure of the economy, as opposed to the macroeconomics. And so that's a really wide array of policies. And in a sense, you can have an industrial policy by accident because there are lots of things the government does that will affect the conditions for business. The important thing about labelling it as a strategy is that signal about consistency over time and prioritisation of the economy's strengths. We've had a lot of chopping and changing in policies. That adds risk for businesses. It increases the return they need to get if they're going to invest. And so consistency is very important. I actually think to some extent leaning into sectors is very welcome, because if you look at the history of industrial policies in the UK over time, governments have identified what are genuine strengths of the UK economy. So it is life sciences, it's the creative sector, it's professional services, and so on. So it's very clear that they're strong sectors. We should enable them to continue growing and do so faster than they have before to help them export. So you don't want to do it in too much detail, because that does become vulnerable to lobbying and narrowness of focus. But actually, I think the strengths of the economy are clear. And because we're in this situation of major technological transformations, decisions taken now by the private sector and by government will affect living standards for decades to come, probably, because the technologies are changing so quickly. So it's absolutely the right moment to think about an industrial strategy that will have an independent industrial strategy council to monitor and evaluate what's happening and to embed that so that we get away from the chopping and changing in policies that we've seen in previous decades.
Charlie, can I just turn to you? Do you think there are any sort of tensions between the growth ambitions that the government has set out and, say, its objective of net zero, or, say, regional strategy or economic security?
I think they can be complementary, but it depends on how they're executed. So I think clearly net zero could be complementary if it involves, for example, the stimulus for a lot of investment that then has spin-off benefits, as Professor Mazzucato was saying. But equally, if you then take a regional approach and you say everybody has to have a little bit, then you end up with the government playing a role which arguably it's not very well placed to play. And I think my observation about previous attempts at doing industrial strategy is they've been too democratic. Everybody has to have a little bit. And then the whole thing ends up sort of caving in on itself. I mean, because effectively it becomes an exercise in advanced lobbying by industry bodies who are basically looking to the government to provide them with money, and they're competing with one another to get the money. And of course there isn't enough money to do that, and nor, critically, is it the role of government to play that role. So in my view, the way you achieve the right kind of alignment around whether your priority is net zero or anything else is to be very selective, to be very disciplined about identifying where there is genuinely the opportunity to create comparative advantage for the UK, and there is a requirement for the government to be an actor alongside industry in facilitating that to happen. And I think so you have to be selective. There has to be really genuine industry leadership. I mean, I'm afraid I've sat on both sides of this fence, and I've seen occasions where industry bodies will take the opportunity to lobby effectively and vocally.
I'm going to pause you there. There's a vote in the House. The panel is suspended. Order. Stands resumed, and we're now going to turn to Sonia Kumar.
Thank you, Chair. Do you think the government, so I'll start with Charlie Mayfield, if that's okay. Do you think the government should lean into its competitive advantages, or do you think it should spread its looking at areas that are slightly weaker with productivity and focus on those?
I think it's a very difficult political issue, this, because there's an enormous draw for the government, any government, on looking at sort of areas of deprivation, for example, and the need to raise them up and to improve those things. But I am firmly of the view that the industrial strategy should be selective and very focused on areas of comparative advantage, because that's really the only way in which it becomes sustainable. And so I would personally advocate for a very focused and disciplined approach to deciding what those areas are, and then recognising where there are absolutely important areas that need to be addressed from an economic standpoint around regions and different parts of the economy, which also perhaps need to be given some kind of stimulation, but be clear about what is actually industrial strategy and what is more about sort of rebalancing the economy.
Sure.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So, while I agree, I think there's something about being really ambitious in what we're trying to do and then translating that into a different type of relationship between the public and private actors, even on things that are quite normal, like lunch, right? So school lunch, school meals, they can either be produced in a very lazy way, and there's a public-private relationship there, or we can have an innovation outcome even on that. So healthy, tasty, sustainable school meals all of a sudden require an outcomes-oriented procurement. And procurement, we should remember, is a very large percentage of every government's budget. And it can do great things like sustainable mobility that I mentioned before, or health for all, or healthy eating. And by having innovative criteria for what we're actually trying to do, that then puts a pressure on that kind of public-private relationship to be, again, outcomes-oriented, requiring investments in human capital and physical capital and innovation. So I was just mentioning during the break in Sweden, because their challenge is a carbon-free welfare state, they've brought it down to the everyday, like the school meal policy. And if you look at what that's done to the supply chains, to the diversification strategy, and to the investments that have had to be made by small, medium, local food suppliers, that then kickstart lots of investment that otherwise would not have happened.
You don't feel like we should be really specific or targeting a specific sector per se? It's more diffuse across all sectors?
Not diffuse, because I would agree with Charlie Mayfield that then you're just spreading the support and it doesn't kind of land anywhere. We need to be extremely ambitious and selective on what the country is actually trying to do. For example, around net zero, and if we are ambitious around net zero, then all of a sudden many different sectors, I gave the example before of steel, but think of cement, think of food, these would all be different sectors that would have to innovate in order to meet those criteria. Denmark, for example, is the #1 provider to China of high-tech green digital services. And that didn't come about by just saying digital, that's our strength. It actually came about because they wanted to have the greenest cities in Europe. And that meant that a lot of the demand-side policies like procurement allowed small companies to scale up because they received support, not just because they were small, but because they were willing to work with the government around the particular types of digital services they needed to help manufacturing to reduce the carbon emissions.
I would think about it in terms of potential, and while leaning into the sectors that we know we're good at, think about where could a government intervention have an unusually large impact on productivity and growth. And that will often be in the supply chains. So if you're thinking about something like life sciences, in certain regions where it's strong, think then about what potential is there for the supply chain in that area.
I just want to nail this point. So,
could I come back on one point?
Yeah, but let me just sharpen it up a bit. So Andy Haldane, for example, is one of those who have argued that we need to just focus on diffusing productivity gains through the economy rather than focusing on a bunch of sectors where we've already got a comparative advantage. Charlie, what I heard you say is you've got to make choices and you've got to prioritise the sectors. You say that despite being the former chair of Be the Business. I just want to
and current chair of Be the Business.
And current chair.
Indeed, and also a big fan of Andy Haldane and his thinking. So and actually the point I'm going to make is kind of in this vein. So if you take, let's take an area like AI, could well be it's not even a sector, but it could be a technology that the government decided was worthy of industrial strategy type focus. And within that, you would immediately say, well, there needs to be a number of supply-side interventions to support it around research and sort of really healthy research base, and probably around infrastructure to make sure we've got the right data centers and what have you. But there's also a demand side to these things. And so if you wanted to try and sort of kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, you could take something like AI and say this is going to be a focus for the industrial strategy of the United Kingdom. And we're going to do things with the government on the supply side, but we're going to apply at least as much effort on the demand side, which is about adoption. Mm-hmm. And the advantage of that is, of course, that applies to every business in every part of the country. It's also something that you can do very different things about. It's not about big capital investment. It's actually about bringing together communities of businesses. It's about stimulating and supporting and encouraging people to experiment and to try doing new things and creating best practice models that then encourage other people to follow. So it's all about diffusion. And it's another way to put it.
Any dissent from that view from Mrs. Mariana?
Well, just that there's specific tools, right, that are useful for demand-side policies. And so we can all talk about demand, but then if we don't actually make use of the tools, like, again, I come back to procurement, then we don't actually create the markets for these companies that are wanting to make investments, and those investments then don't even get diffused through that market creation potential. So in the United States, for example, they have the SBIR program where every government department, defense, energy, health, have to spend between 3 to 5% of their budget on procuring in innovative solutions from small and medium enterprises, and historically this has been how those small companies scaled. So instead of glorifying the role of small companies and saying that we should support them, the question is, why don't we allow these tools that we have to actually help those companies grow around those priorities? And so this idea of actually having priorities instead of just spreading out support to small companies, but by setting the priorities and using public loans, guarantees, subsidies, and procurement policies to help steer our investments so we're actually achieving the kind of transformations that we want. Again, net zero, reducing the digital divide, stronger and healthier population.
Yeah, Professor Coyle, anything to add?
Fusion often happens through supply chains. So leading companies will ask their suppliers to adopt new technologies once they have themselves. So that's a supply-side way that the diffusion spreads.
Great. Antonio Pence.
Thank you very much. So we're all looking towards the spending review expected in June. What sort of scale of funding should this government be looking to dedicate to driving the industrial strategy? Diane Coyle?
So there's a macroeconomic judgment in that I'm not going to go anywhere near. The scale of what investment is needed, to go back to where we started this conversation, is quite large. And it isn't just public sector investment. The UK private sector has underinvested relative to its own value added as well, and this has been going on for decades. So if you're comparing internationally, our investment performance has been poor for a long time, and that's quite a lot to catch up. So how does that translate into a 1 year or 5 year spending envelope is a different question, and there will have to be priorities set, which is part of the reason I'm advocating for the kind of focus that we were just discussing, that you have to start somewhere, and you pick some areas of the economy, some sectors, if you like, where you think you can have easy wins. But the other aspect of this is getting the value for the money that's being spent, and that requires joining up government policies across different areas. Focus today is industrial strategy, but there is also the new towns work that's going on, economies happen in places, so that has to join up. All of the work on the health of the population has to join up as well. So it's not just how much is being spent, but how effective is it all being spent. That comes through the kind of joining up in government policies that we also have not seen for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers really matter. So had the UK invested the average that was invested on the public investment side, the average of the OECD over the last 2 decades, we would have invested 500 billion more. So we have massively underinvested, but what we don't want is just helicopter money, right? We need kind of institutional capacity. So what's critical in any country, and it's not just about industrial strategy, is that kind of system of innovation, the national system of innovation. So catapult centers, for example, have been created in the United Kingdom, basically copying the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, but we massively underspend on them. And also how they've been structured haven't been as ambitious. For example, in the Fraunhofer Institutes, it's not the scientists who ask industry what they need. They think together what the future of the auto industry might look like. And there's that real kind of dynamism between the science and industrial community. Similarly with public banks, we now have the National Wealth Fund, very important, and hopefully they will continue to kind of back it. But again, we have had very little patient long-term finance in this country. We brag about financial services, but we've had problematic financial services and finance. We have impatient finance. We haven't had the kind of finance that, again, has allowed in Germany small companies to become medium-sized companies through the KfW. So I think we need to give much more attention to institutional design and find also where the gaps are. And also break down this dichotomy. Like when we talk about the market is not the same thing as business. The market is an outcome of how business is governed, how public institutions are governed, and instead of thinking of the public institutions as just fixing market failures, the kind of dynamics that we've just been talking about are about creating and shaping markets. And corporate governance, my view, is in this country is part of the problem. So when we have, say, Thames Water, for example, that doesn't reinvest its profits back into infrastructure, and the profits are financialized in terms of just giving them out as dividend payouts and in some cases share buybacks, that's part of what we should be looking at, because we need both public and private working together, but governance structures are very different globally. You were part of John Lewis, that's a cooperative. That's very different from just maximizing shares.
Thank you. And Charlie?
I think if you start from the point of view of how much money there should be in the spending review, almost certainly the answer is going to be not enough, because in the current state of public finances, that's probably the only answer you can get to. So I really do agree that I think you have to approach this in a broader way and think about public and private investment, as my colleagues have really made that point very well. But I would also add to that there are different forms of investment. And something that I think is consistently missed is how far money can go on the demand side. As an example, Be the Business has done a load of evaluation work. We're a not-for-profit. We work with small and mid-sized businesses to stimulate growth and productivity. And over several years now, we've made initiatives on the ground, really practical things, supporting leaders of small and mid-sized businesses in their leadership and their development of their own ambitions, and on tech adoption. And we took one group of 2,600 of those businesses where we had 3 years prior and 3 years post data and performance. And what we could show is there was £1 billion of additional gross value added from the interventions that we had made, which were very, very cheap, by the way. If you reached 50,000 of businesses, you would probably be talking in the order of having 20 billion kinds of value in terms to the economy from those kinds of things. And it speaks to the point about AI adoption. The kinds of things we do is we run workshops with businesses in local communities, supported actually by people like Microsoft, who have helped us a lot with this. And we get fantastic results. And you get people on the way towards tech adoption. And it's ground level stuff. It doesn't cost much money, but it has a huge impact, and it gets people started on growth. And so I would just say for the spending review, yes, the big numbers are important, but they'll never be big enough. You've got to create the ecosystem, but please don't forget the demand side. And it is the diffusion point, which is also what I'm sort of banging the drum for.
And Professor Coyle, you'd probably add something about competition policy as well, I think.
Absolutely vital. It's very easy for people in business to confuse regulation and competition policy, because competition policy sometimes stops them doing things they want to do. But they're very different tools. And there's a mountain of evidence that it's very important to keep markets competitive, because that's how businesses do scale up and grow. So we're not going to have a healthy AA sector in the economy if the thriving, very small businesses we have, median number of employees is 10 in the sector, if they can't enter and grow into digital markets. So the competition aspect on the supply side, on the structure, is absolutely vital.
Thank you. Matt Weston.
I'm just very interested to hear what your thoughts are on how the government should go about putting money into an industrial strategy. Particularly interested to hear thoughts on other countries' approach, and of course perhaps one of the ones we're most familiar with is, say, Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. Any thoughts, Professor Coyle?
I think it's quite variable, and it depends on exactly what you think the gaps are or the problems are in different places around the country or different sectors or supply chains in the economy. So, for example, based as I am in Cambridge, I know a lot about the life sciences and tech sectors there. And what they need to grow is the ability to build labs and housing, the skills of mid-level technicians, some infrastructure investment and some transport investment. That will be very different from what's needed in an area like those northern English cities, Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, where you can see the potential for a big increase in productivity across the area by creating a single labour market connected by better transport. And that will be different sectors. It will be advanced manufacturing and materials, but it will also be all of the supply chains and the what's often called the everyday economy. And so that is a different kind of investment. So I think it's really a question of the kind of analysis. You pick your priority areas and identify for those areas what the specific needs will be. And then that in turn determines what the ask is of government in terms of public investment.
Can I come in on
Yes.
this? So I had the honor to work with Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce in the United States, over the CHIPS Act, and it was a very interesting opportunity to learn both the lessons, the positive and negative, of what got us Silicon Valley. So huge amounts of public investments went into Silicon Valley. We wouldn't have any of the smart technologies in our smartphones without that public investment, so internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. But ultimately, because some of the contracts were badly structured, we socialized risks but privatized rewards. And I've written a whole book about this called The Entrepreneurial State. And what she came to me for was to say, well, how can we do it better this time? And so it was very interesting how the CHIPS Act ultimately had much more of a good deal, like a symbiotic reciprocity, mutualistic deal, if you want, between that public program, over $300 billion to semiconductor companies. There was conditions that they had to reinvest their profits, not just use share buybacks. Globally, we have $7 trillion, that's a lot of money, being used for share buybacks over the last 10 years. That's a lack of reinvestment. They have to improve working conditions and use energy-efficient supply chains. So it's not about micromanaging companies, but it's about saying, again, what is the direction of the economy? If we want a more inclusive growth, so less inequality, more sustainable growth around net zero, how does any public-private relationship, even around tech and semiconductors, become an opportunity to help steer? And second, this whole idea, I mean, I think maybe disagree a bit about the sectors because, you know, Italy, where I was originally from, I have UK citizenship, Italian citizenship, and US citizenship. Italy has all the different sectors that we have here too, and probably have quite a lot of competitiveness as well, but they've had huge problems, again, in terms of how public and private have worked together. So when you have a parasitic relationship where, again, private companies are just receiving funds without there being conditions around what's required by the private sector, then we end up with low productivity, low investment, low growth. And that's similar, I think, to here. So by actually having some goals around net zero, all of a sudden the question is, what does that mean for the types of digital services? Or if we look at during COVID with AstraZeneca, super interesting that particular vaccine ended up being quite different from the other vaccines because the goal that was being set by the researchers were that they wanted a vaccine that could be produced globally. We needed to vaccinate the world, so the conditions were around knowledge sharing. So that required a particular type of innovative collaboration that would not have existed had there not been a goal. So I don't think there's a contrast between thinking about sectors and thinking about goals, but by having clear goals and directions, all of a sudden that means that the relationship between these public programs, procurement, grants, loans, and so on, are different in terms of how it creates potential reciprocity, if you want, between public and private actors.
Okay, and Charlie, I'm conscious of time, so perhaps if you just briefly, before we have to go, answer this question, which is really about looking at, Professor Mazzucato was talking about loans versus grants, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on what government strategy should be, given that, say, UK and France spend similar amounts of money. UK tends to go more on the basis of loans, France more in terms of grants. What do you think is better, and how do you think Parliament should be judging success? What sort of criteria do you think Parliament should use?
I think again, the thing is, when government is providing money, whether it's in the form of a loan or a grant, you create in some ways the wrong dynamics, because then everybody's looking to sort of qualify for the grant or for the loan, where actually what you should be having is businesses that are really hungry to make investment because they're going to get a great return on it. And so you can actually end up sort of, frankly, distorting the market a bit if you do those things. And also there are too many examples where government has come up with schemes. I mean, tech adoption was one. The digital adoption, what was it called? Learning to Grow or something. There was £5,000 sort of loans to people to implement different tech adoptions, and there was very, very disappointing take up. And it's because there's a sort of misunderstanding of the psychology within a business. And if somebody comes along and says, well, okay, I'm going to give you £5,000, basically without many strings attached, the business person says, well, I could take that, but I've got so many other things on my plate, and there are so many issues with making that tech adoption that doesn't look very attractive to me, and I'm very busy anyway, and I'll move on to the next thing. So I just don't think there's really any short-circuiting the importance of creating the leadership and stimulating the leadership within businesses and within the communities of businesses. And I think the only thing I'd add to your prior question, I think I'd again defer to my colleagues about some of the more sort of the supply side economics of this. But in other countries that generally do industrial strategy better, they also have stronger industry bodies and often stronger connections between trade unions and industry bodies than we have here. You know, if you generally, there are some very good bodies, I won't sort of mention them, but they also tend to be stronger, and sometimes it's a requirement to be a member of them in some of those other countries. And you create the mechanisms where you can aggregate leadership of businesses so that you can then engage better with some of the government programs on a more level basis, and that's something which is missing. I mean, I've seen so many occasions where business and government are both trying to tackle something important, and they just keep going past each other and not really engaging. And that's what industrial strategy's got to be about, bringing this together. And you have to think hard about how do you create the conditions where that's more likely to succeed. Well,
let's just push on the institutions. Gregor Poynton.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Professor Mazzucato, you talked about the goals, but keen to focus on how we get the institutions of government to make it then work. I mean, you've talked about mission-driven government being part of that. Do we have the right institutions just now within the UK government? What institutions do you think we perhaps might need, and are there any that you think we might need to get rid of in order to deliver on the goals we're talking about here? Perhaps go to you first then.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been progress in terms of institutions. Again, thinking about a national system of innovation and all the different types of high-quality universities, of course, but also more midstream, those science and industry linkages through institutions like the catapults, very important. Then on the demand side, rethinking procurement. There's, I mentioned before, SBIR in the US. Here we have SBRI, but again, it's been under, if you want, used. And so I think it's more how all these different institutions also align and coordinate, and that really is the power of what I call mission-oriented industrial strategy. And we've just put out a report about this, of the global insights in Brazil and Sweden and the US, of what it meant for these institutions to work better together so that the sum is bigger than the parts. Take a public bank. It can either just give out loans and, as you say, probably just go to the companies that are asking for help, and maybe they need help because they haven't been investing enough, or you can have a public bank that is in fact more mission aligned, that makes sure that those loans are being used to actually push the frontier of what's happening in the country, and those companies that need to in fact reduce, for example, the material content of production to meet those carbon neutrality goals, then require that finance to reach something difficult. So instead of just giving out loans to stay in place, using strategic mission-oriented loans to help companies actually reach objectives that the country requires in order to transform the direction of growth, because that's what we should remember. Growth doesn't just have a rate, it has a direction. And if we don't do that, then you just end up with lots of different instruments and lots of different projects, but the country itself doesn't transform, and you don't get inclusive growth and you don't get sustainable growth.
Charlie Mayfield, view on institutions. We've got the right institutions in this country or not?
We've got some of the right institutions, undoubtedly.
Okay. What are we missing?
Well, I think my view is that we should be looking to drive more growth through regions. I think that where you've got some of the more developed mayoral authorities, I think they're already showing some potential in terms of sort of being able to sort of actually deliver quite a lot of or creating better conditions for growth. And I think there's potential for us to do more through them. I mean, I mentioned before the work that we've done in Be the Business. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We have limited funding. We have managed, though, despite that, to create a lot of GVA and very healthy improvements. I would love to actually use ourselves and the other organisations we can crowd in to support mayoral authorities to drive a growth strategy at a local level, which also has the advantage of it not being dependent on taking years to make investments and planning and infrastructure, etc. It's stuff that could be delivered really quite quickly. And so I think we should be using some of those more to drive some of the growth.
Okay, just in the final few minutes we've got on this panel, Professor Coyle, what would you add to this story about institutions?
Definitely agree about devolution. If you think about how the UK differs from other countries, it's in being so highly centralised, and this means a loss of information about what matters to local economies, and the mayoral authorities are obviously going to be a good vehicle for reversing that. The other thing is obviously the Industrial Strategy Council, which will be on a statutory basis. We're one of the few countries that hasn't had a permanent body of that kind. And the reason that's important is partly monitoring the government and holding it to account, but also partly reducing the uncertainty in the policy churn, which, as I said right at the start, is one of the reasons that investment is just that bit riskier in the UK compared to other countries.
I'm really sorry that the time is against us on this panel and we have to pull stumps there. I feel like we've only just got going, but thank you so much for giving this inquiry a flying start, and we would be incredibly grateful if we could continue to draw on your advice over the course of the weeks to come before we finalise our report to Parliament ahead of the Comprehensive Spending Review. But that concludes this panel. Order, order.
Thank you.
Very much.
Comfortably?
I am.
Great. Order. Welcome to this second panel of the Business and Trade Select Committee's hearings into the government's forthcoming industrial policy. Clare, Barclay, we're delighted that you're able to join us today for your first outing in front of the Select Committee. I'm sure it will be the first of many. We've all got lots of questions for you, but perhaps you could just give us first your take on this very ambitious target that the Prime Minister has set for becoming the fastest growing economy in the G7. We've obviously had some difficult economic forecast news last week, and the end of this Parliament will be with us before we know it. What's your view about how achievable it's going to be to hit that target of becoming the fastest growing economy in the G7?
I mean, it's not without its challenges, of course, but this is about ambition. And I think that the UK has many great assets that means that growth and future growth have enormous potential. I think you've heard from the Prime Minister and the whole of the Cabinet about the priority for growth. And so I guess as the chair of the Industrial Strategy Council, it's really about how we can play a role in helping stimulate that through focus, through supply chain, through some of the cross-cutting issues, and thinking about how you bring that together with the right place in the country. I can talk a little bit about some of the things I've learned along the way. It's still quite early days, but I'm happy to share.
Okay. Would you bet on us becoming the fastest growing economy in the G7 by the end of the Parliament?
Well, I think, I think if you think about some of the assets that the UK has, compared to other faster growing countries like the US, China, etc. I think it actually, if we think on the topic of technology, for example, it is extremely well placed. It's the third largest country in terms of growth potential, in terms of skills, in terms of universities, in terms of investment. And so really it's about how do you take the very best of what the UK has got to offer and think about how to fuel that. I mean, I think the previous panel articulated extremely well. The UK has been underinvested in, and this is really about how do you unlock the great potential that you've got and think about this partnership between government and between business, and think about how you unlock the potential that we have.
So I didn't hear you say yes in answer to that question.
Well, I guess I wouldn't have taken the chair job if I didn't believe there was some potential in it.
So you think it's within the bounds of possibility?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you. Sonia Cuba.
Chair, do you think the Green Paper has the right priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Green Paper was about setting out what we believe the priorities are, and you can see they've been laid out in terms of picking the areas that have the greatest growth potential. And this was really about putting the Green Paper out in order to start the consultation process and get feedback on that. And we had 3,000 responses from that, of which just over 200 or so included from the business associations, which obviously have thousands and thousands of smaller business members. So I think there was very good participation on it. And this is about kind of, we've set what we believe were initially the right strategies, but this is about listening and learning. And that's also part of what the Council has been doing in terms of meeting with the business associations, engagement with the regions, etc. And that will be about how that gets fine-tuned before the white paper is released in the spring.
And what has the feedback been from the businesses now that the Green Paper has been released?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, if I kind of look at it from a helicopter view, I think there is extremely positive feedback on a prioritisation for an industrial strategy. I think the feedback on having an industrial strategy council that has a plan to be there in perpetuity has also been extremely positive. I met yesterday with the B5, which is the CBI, Chambers of Commerce, FSB, etc. And it was overwhelmingly positive that the government was putting this level of priority. It's something that businesses have been crying out for. And the fact that we have extremely strong business, academic, union, government representation on that, this is about agitating to make sure that we get a strategy that meets the ambition to drive growth for the country and also has one that meets the needs of the businesses.
Have you actually seen the white paper?
Yes, I have. I mean, obviously, the white paper itself is in production, so it's not final. So, yeah. Green paper I have, obviously, as you would expect.
We've all seen that. Thank you. Very good point.
Yeah, I mean, if we look back, even just in the fairly recent past, you've had the coalition government had a version of this, and then there have been two sort of in the post-Brexit era. I'm just keen to understand what you think we should look at and learn from, things that perhaps have worked, but also things that clearly haven't in that time, given the sort of ongoing changing nature of these strategies.
Yeah, and I have, obviously some of the people that were involved previously I've had the pleasure of spending some time with. So I think there's a couple of things I would reflect on and have had fed back to me. I think there's something about the statutory intent of this industrial council that I think is very important in terms of giving irrespective of the government, is something that will last in perpetuity, and actually for businesses and investors can give confidence to the long-lasting nature of that. So I think that would be one. The second is about the involvement cross-government. So this is not just, this is very much sponsored by business and trade as well as Treasury, but this is an agenda that goes right across government, and I think the Treasury involvement in this in particular is something that I welcome, that is something that would be lessons learnt from previously. So I think those would be the two things I would call out.
And a key part of what we're looking at is how we would judge success.
Yeah.
So I'd be keen to get your sense on what we should be looking at to see if this works or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a complex set of work streams that we are working across that kind of takes the priority focus for growth. It takes cross-cutting themes like regulation, skills, access to finance, etc. And then it intersects that with place. So you've got this kind of complicated matrix, and across that, looking at how we put the right measurement control systems in place is one of the established work streams, which is extremely important for how we set the right strategy and how, as both the government and the Industrial Strategy Council, that we can deem whether that particular intervention has been a success or not. So expect that to be published once the white paper comes.
And would that have numbers attached to
Absolutely.
that then, so that we can
Absolutely.
track progress against that?
Absolutely.
Great. The other part that we touched on towards the end of the last session was about how does government have the right institutions to make that work. You talked about the cross-cutting nature of it. I'd just be keen to explore with you if you think we've got the right institutions in place currently, and if not, what additional institutions and framework would we need within government to make this work?
Yeah, I would say my discovery on that is early days, so I don't want to profess to be an expert on the institutions of the UK. I think what I have been pleased with in the appointment of the council members is both the makeup of that very much includes some of the other councils and includes the unions, so that you actually have that form of representation. And then we're also thinking about the engagement mechanism with the likes of business associations, with the regions, with the mayors, connecting with, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. I think we've got good, we have some small business representation, we have entrepreneur representation. So we're trying to make sure that with the council itself, and then that we're interlocking with the right institutions across the country who are very much connected to the front line of what's going on in the UK and across the regions, to make sure that we get that feedback.
Antonio Pence.
I was interested in what you had to say about the cross-departmental working and your reflections on that in previous industrial strategies. As we went around the country during our fact-finding to set the agenda for this committee, it was precisely that cross-departmental working and the join-up that was flagged time and time and again to us by the businesses, the unions that we were talking to, particularly the interface with the energy department. I think and the interface with skills would be the two, as well as Treasury. I'm close to the steel industry. The impact of CBAM is really important. So how do you think you will approach that really knotty issue of making sure that the Industrial Strategy Council is actually exercising influence towards other departments than DBT?
Yeah.
Hans has been quite polite about the feedback that we received. It was pretty damning.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's good to hear that feedback.
How are you going to fix that?
Yeah, so I think when I was appointed, I met with most of the Secretary of States for each department at their request, actually. So I took that as a positive first sign. I have subsequently met with the Prime Minister on this topic to say, look, in order for this to be successful, I need his support for how this is made a priority. If growth is the main agenda and the Industrial Strategy Council is there to support that, I need to make sure that that is made a priority across all of the departments.
What did he say?
He was like, I am here to support. This is absolutely, growth is the total priority for the country. The Industrial Strategy Council is a core part of that. And he offered intervention and support if I faced any blockers or barriers along the way. So, and I will take him up on that as I hit them.
Thank you. Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think, picking up on that point, with growth being at the forefront of the ambition of the Prime Minister, do you think that the right amount of money has been set aside for the industrial strategy, and how might your thinking go for that?
I know this question got asked before in terms of how much money. In a thing where you're trying to drive growth and change the trajectory of productivity and opportunity for the country, it's like a piece of string, isn't it, as to how much money. What I would say is, maybe repeating what I've said in the answer to the last question, this has been put centre as the core strategy and growth for the government. Certainly the investment that's been put into the council itself, one of the other lessons learned, perhaps building on the previous question, was whether there was enough impetus around the secretarial support, the operational support for both the council and the council members, and that's been increased quite significantly. We have a very large secretariat in order to support, and that's both for the council itself as well as how that works across government and how we make sure that some of the recommendations that are being put forward are listened and heard. So I was appointed in November. We had our first council meeting in December. We have our next one this week. So maybe that might be a question for me to come back to as to whether there's enough investment. I've not found there to be insufficient support, and I have all the support I need in order to get the job done.
What's your gut feel? You said at the top of this session that you were reasonably confident that we could become the fastest growing economy in the G7. That basically on current figures entails us about tripling the growth rate. Yeah. What is your gut feel about whether the order of magnitude, don't give us the precise number necessarily, but is the order of magnitude in the right place?
Yeah, maybe I don't want to unpick what I said earlier on, but I do want to clarify. This is a very, we're here to drive ambition, but it is a tough task ahead of us, in terms of change. If you look at if you go back since the financial crisis, the UK economy has not grown. So we've remained a steady state, and that doesn't fare well versus some of our, comparable counterparts. And so we have to think about both ambition and focus and what is it that's going to unlock. It's having spent some time with Treasury and the economics departments, it is somewhat like a bowl of spaghetti because there's lots of different intersecting parts in terms of how you go about that. And I think we have to put focus on the things, the sectors that are driving growth. I mean, I happen in my day job to work for a large technology company. I know there's growth and opportunity out there because I see it every day, and I know that can drive productivity. I know that can drive enablement. I know that can drive ecosystem growth. It can drive small business growth. But this is really about how you unlock that in magnitude, and that's just looking at one of the sectors. I think some of that is about how much the government invests. I think, to the previous speaker, Charlie, I think it's also about what you unlock in terms of investment from large companies and what you unlock in the stimulus with small and medium-sized companies and how you connect those ecosystems together. Certainly, if I look at the tech sector, this isn't about, big businesses, small businesses, government. This is about interlocking all of it together with the universities, together with future jobs, that's going to really unlock that as future potential. And that industry in itself has significant potential for the UK.
You're not drawing the conclusion that this is just hopelessly underfunded?
Not yet. No. And as I said, I've had 2 meetings on this. I believe that the government is putting significant priority on this. We're working towards the publication of the white paper ahead of the funding rounds, etc. And maybe that might be a question we can come back to as we progress through in more detail.
Sarah, do you want to pursue?
Obviously you talked about the statutory intent, which is really important because I think that shows the commitment behind it. The government had said that the council's recommendations, I quote, should not include specific proposals for tax or spending measures or proposals for appropriate levels of spending. So do you think you've got enough scope to speak up if there are things that you might come across that might be undermining, the strategy for growth and the work of the Industrial Strategy and Council?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the job of the council is to look at the publication of both the industry, the cross-cutting, the place strategies, etc., and make sure that we are agitating those to enable them. Are they fit for purpose? Are they going to be ambitious enough? Are they going to drive growth? So I think that's why the remit has been set as the way it is. It's one of the growth pillars for the overall industry strategy, and the reason we've formed the council the way that it has is really to make sure that we are in a position to agitate. We're not policymakers in our own right, we're business leaders in the main, in order to make sure that we intervene on the things that we don't think are bold enough or ambitious enough, funded enough, etc. And so I think, so far we've already intervened on a number of areas that we believe were not clear or not precise enough, and the feedback from government has been very receptive to that.
What were those interventions?
We've done, there's obviously the whole streams that we've been working on. So one in particular was on AI, one was on skills, one was on regulation, that said, in order to think about some of the unblocks of those, have they gone far enough? Is it clear enough for businesses? Are we going to create enough innovation, just as some examples?
Yeah. Thank you, Matt Weston.
Just a very quick question, and that is, you mentioned that you'd met with most of the Secretaries of State, I think, for different departments. Specifically, have you met with the Chancellor and have you met with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster? Because they're both key players in bringing this together. I
have met with the Chancellor and the Chancellor's team. I've not met yet with the Duchy of Lancaster. Okay. The ones I met, for clarity, were all the Secretary of States that were present at the investment summit as the council was appointed and announced. So it wasn't a lack of willing, they just, not there.
Okay,
so,
thanks. Antonia Burns.
Yeah. Thank you. In the course of this inquiry and our parallel inquiry into the Employment Rights Bill, we've heard that for many businesses they want joined-up regulation, and in some cases they want less regulation. Is your job to deliver less regulation?
I think our job is to look at the regulatory framework and how that lines up to the growth agenda for the government.
Thank you.
Ron Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I've got a horrible cold, I'm afraid. The government's committed to put the Industrial Strategy Council on a statutory footing. And you've said that you don't want to talk about the budget and you don't want to talk about staffing levels, although I think you've said that the Secretariat's actually going to be quite large. And you also talked about the bowl of spaghetti. How do you avoid becoming another strand in that bowl of spaghetti, and an expensive strand at that. How do you become the fork that draws those strands together? What sort of powers do you think you might need to do that?
Again, a good question. So, I mean, we have no desire to be a strand in the bowl of spaghetti. You don't want to add to already complex things in that regard. And I think that was part of the thought and consideration of both the remit of the council, the importance of it being put on a statutory footing, so that this has longevity outside of government. And I would just, for this committee, I would just underscore the importance of that. It was sort of part of why I accepted the job as the chair. And I think it's really trying to make sure that that you become, with the skills and capability that we have on the council, you become an independent body that can be an agitator for, I won't use the spaghetti analogy, but you become an agitator for how you streamline that meal, how you streamline and pick the things that are going to make the very best ingredients that deliver the best outcome. That's the intent, and certainly every single member of the council, both they were Secretary of State appointees, but every single one that I met as part of that process were only interested in being part of the council if they felt that they could be an agitator for change and an agitator for the growth agenda for the country. It wasn't to be either another strand in the spaghetti or to be another member of another council or another advisory. The statutory part was extremely important to them because they felt like that was one of the missing ingredients, and the cross-government involvement was also very important to them, and that actually has been some of the things that we've agitated on already as part of.
Can I just check this? So you've used this phrase helpfully a few times about agitating for the right thing, but as Ms Edwards pointed out, the government has said that the council's recommendations, quotes, should not include specific proposals for tax or spending measures or proposals for the appropriate level of spending. I mean, what are you agitating for? Are you basically being banned from agitating on the core thing?
No, we're not. I mean, if you think of the work streams that we are working on, it's making sure that the constitute of them are fit for purpose. So I used the example of regulation earlier on. Is it going far enough? Does it have a growth agenda? If you're thinking about the constitute of what will it take to make the UK, one of the world leaders in AI, do you have the right skills and capability? Have you thought about the role that government plays in the way they do procurement? Have you thought about skills for small businesses? Have you thought about the supply chain that you would go after, just as some examples?
Useful. Sorry, Mr.
You've got something of a dichotomy, I think, in that you need to be quite close to government, in that you're going to have to coordinate all these people. But you're also talking about being outside and being separate and being agitators, as you say. So do you think you're going to have an office in government? And if you do think that, where would that sit then? Would that sit at Treasury, or where would that sit?
I mean, that might be a question for government, because that's obviously we're in the process of working through what the slot for the statutory side is.
What would you ask me of them? I mean, the final decision will sit with government, of course.
I don't know if I have an opinion on that at this stage. I mean, I think you need some independence, but you obviously don't want to be too far away. So I think maybe next time I come back, I can answer that question.
So at this stage, have you got a budget for the council?
No.
Do you know how many staff you're going to have?
The Secretariat, and the team can correct me if I'm wrong on this, are currently about 35.
Okay, and do you know what your powers are going to be?
Well, we've set out the remit for the council is very clearly published, and we will be working to that.
But will you have any legal powers?
Again, we're in the process of looking at how that will come into statutory, so that's not determined yet.
Okay, and have they given you an office?
No.
Okay. Right, no budget, 35 staff, unclear powers, and no base yet. So there's still some work to do in getting the infrastructure.
That's right, and as I said, we've had one meeting so far. So, I appreciate that, I actually like that you've called me here for this meeting, but it is a very early start to the work that we've been asked to do.
That's useful to know. Okay, Charlie Maynard.
Afternoon, thank you for being here. So focusing on productivity and growth, which is why this has been set up as a council, and if possible focusing on the economics rather than the politics. If we were inside the customs union, the single market, what would that do for economic growth?
Can you repeat the question?
If we were inside the single market and the customs union, what would that do for UK economic growth?
I don't know if I know the answer to that question.
Really?
Yeah.
We've got a data adequacy agreement that if it doesn't get signed in the summer, is going to be a real problem for companies.
I don't know if I'm the expert to answer that question, so sorry.
Okay.
No further questions.
Okay, Antonia Bence.
Thank you very much, Chair. Since the election, we've seen a number of our large companies in a variety of different sectors get into trouble, whether it be Stellantis in Luton, whether it be the refinery at Grangemouth, whether it be AstraZeneca and the failed investment there. What role will the Industrial Strategy Council have where things are demonstrably going wrong in terms of intervening? Will that be one of the topics of your agitation?
That's not in the remit of the...
Not in the remit, so you wouldn't be taking a view on the public policy lessons from those?
No, I mean, we're looking at, we have a clear remit on the growth sectors that have been picked, the cross-cutting themes, plus the place. Obviously, we're going to be taking feedback from businesses. We have good representation on the council, as I made reference to, but that's not in the remit in the charter.
Grangemouth, for example, it's an oil refinery. One of the growth areas in the industrial strategy is around clean energy. One would think that there might be a possibility for the Industrial Strategy Council to take a useful view on whether we might need oil refineries in the future, possibly even for sustainable aviation fuel.
What I would say on that is if you were looking at the green energy priority, and we're trying to think about what the interventions would be, the people that are working on that particular work stream may take some learnings from that, for example, but it wouldn't be in the kind of investigation of that particular thing. It would be taking the learnings from it for how we would think about unlocking growth for the country, which is the purpose of the council.
And alongside growth, will you take wider considerations into account as well? In both Luton and in Grangemouth, what we've seen are depressed areas where there will be losses of significant numbers of jobs. Now, obviously, there's a national mission around growth, but also seeing the place-based dimension of some of the decisions that are made to invest or not to invest is really important. And would you be taking learning in that direction as well?
Well, part of the makeup of the council was also including the unions. You'll hear from Kate later on. And so I think actually making sure that we have the unions' point of view as we think about the resolute focus on growth and what does that do, that's part of the feedback that they will give us as part of the process.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's an Industrial Strategy Council. Now, we understand tax is outside that remit. I just asked about single markets and customs union, and you said that was not something you were going to give a view on. So what aspects of trade are inside the remit or outside the remit?
Yeah, so the part of the place, so the focus actually is more on how to drive growth for the UK, but you can imagine place could indicate how to unlock manufacturing growth in the Midlands, for example, but place could also include what is the partnerships internationally that we will go after. And I had the pleasure of meeting all of the equivalents doing industrial strategy at Winfield House 2 weeks ago, where I met all the international counterparts, talked about the work we were doing on the council, talked about the charter that we had, and had the opportunity to learn from them.
If I may,
yeah.
So if we've got trade, so what part, trade is about supply chains, international supply chains as well as domestic supply chains. So is trade and our relationships with our trading partners and what's working and what's not working inside your scope for Industrial Strategy Council or outside?
I'm sorry to be a little bit vague on the answer. The focus at the moment was about getting the council set up and being part of the UK. But actually, the place, in partnership with the trade team, is really about, if you're thinking about unlocking something for energy, it's actually thinking about supply chain, both the place in the UK as well as supply chain out. So we are doing some work on it, but we've only just started that. So.
Do you think it would be a good idea if trade was included in your remit?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I work for a large international company that invests in the UK, so yes, of course.
Yes, but services have done done okay. Goods are being hammered. And so what I'm worried about is all those manufacturing companies in the UK are being smacked by being cut off from key markets, and what we're going to do about it. And I'm worried that it seems that trade is not clearly part of your remit or otherwise.
It is. I mean, obviously, manufacturing is advanced manufacturing is one of the growth sectors that we're going after.
Which bits of trade are inside your remit? What are you going to be doing as a council on trade?
We've had one meeting. so far. So, like, if you could give me time to kind of get this set up and moving, I appreciate it.
It's a really fair answer. You can see what we're doing is we're just trying to basically check the circumference of where you're going to go.
They're good questions for me to take back and clarify, so I appreciate it.
I think, so just to absolutely pin this down, would your ambition for the council be that in due course it could provide productive advice on the kind of trade strategy that we're going to need in order to deliver the industrial strategy that delivers the growth that's...
In my mind, if you think about the growth sectors that we're going after that we think will drive growth for the country, you know, there is a natural parallel there to where you think, I don't know, and I'll pick my own sector because I know it better. If you're thinking about growing the UK to be the strongest AI and tech superpower, or one of them, you can't do that without thinking about trade partnerships and thinking about inward investment of the larger tech companies. How they can create ecosystems? Do you have the right data centres? Do you have the right energy to go after it? So absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Briefly, do you want to...
So I was glad to hear you mention manufacturing in the Midlands. Subject very close to the heart. A number of us on this committee as Midlands MPs. Many people would say that an industrial strategy would normally focus on industry rather than what the wider set of services industries. Do you think that you have the right makeup for your council to ensure that you really focus in on the good manufacturing jobs that we want to see in this country? We want growth with good jobs.
I mean, the government has set out a very clear focus on the industries that they believe will drive growth for the country. Advanced manufacturing is one of those, but actually it's very important if you think maybe learning lessons from the past and not bifurcating the focus and spreading the focus too thin. How do you think about growth in the sectors that are providing opportunity for the country? And so that's really about making choices, and then thinking about the cross-cutting themes that will unlock growth, and then intersecting that with the place, which is kind of why I mentioned the advanced manufacturing and Birmingham. So we're trying to be, as part of the council's job, we're trying to help the government with the focus of what will deliver growth for the country.
I'm very, very glad you have an eye for the Birmingham and the Black Country.
Very good point.
On that, then, you talk about the 8 growth sectors. Do you think they're the correct sectors?
Yeah, I mean, we tried to not take people's opinion but use it on data. And if you look at the data based on the first round of meetings I did with the Treasury and the economics team, those are the sectors that have provided the growth over the last couple of years for the country. And so this is, and I think they've tried to look at where future trends are going to go as well. So it's not just a backward looking, it's also thinking about some of the global trends that are going on and where what does it take in order to position the UK well. Yeah,
because that was actually going to be my follow-up, was about how much focus on the future, because they may have been comparative advantage for us over the last decade, 15 years or so on, but for me it's what is next is more important. And clearly you want to build on the advantage you have, is make sure are there sectors that are nascent now that we think we should be investing in. The example we always use around this table is Chinese AVs, and the fact they had nowhere and they decided as a country to get somewhere, and to make that kind of big bet. Do you think there's enough of that within the current?
Yeah, I mean, I would say based on the data that I've seen, they've looked at both future trends, future potential market growth, as well as growth as it's driving today, and I feel they're focused enough but encompassing enough to make sure that we've got future growth potential as well. I think some of the feedback and learnings from what happened in the automotive sector and the bet on EV is a good lesson, I would suggest, that says how do you test where future growth will come from in the sectors that are picked. But I think based on the data that I've seen, I think they've picked the right ones. And some of this is about making sure that we don't splinter this too much. I'll try and pick the ones that really have growth potential, and you pick the enablement as part of that.
Okay, last couple of questions. How did you get the job?
I was approached by the Department of Business and Trade.
Okay, so it wasn't a competitive application process?
No, I don't know what the process was behind that, but I was reached out in order, and I think part of what I've been told as part of it. My job at previously I was the CEO of Microsoft for the last 4 years. I've recently moved from that role, still at Microsoft. But part of my role is working across all industries. So I work with government, I work with manufacturing, I work with retail, all of them. So as far as the technology agenda is concerned, I've had experience, I guess, of working across many of the different sectors. So I had an appreciation of that. And then many of the industries I've had the pleasure of working with, I had an opportunity to kind of work with and partner with on the council.
Yeah, and it's a paid role?
There is some per diem payment that was decided actually for all the council members to make sure that it wasn't kind of a part-time advisory thing, that it was actually something that people put time and commitment into. And I think, people said that they thought that was right, so that there was... It was actually less about the money. It was more about making sure that people always prioritise the time, given how important this council's job is.
And how much time are you going to give it?
The contracted terms are 2 to 3 days a month.
It doesn't sound much for such a big topic.
And already it's challenging, I would say. So I think part of it is actually how do I prioritise where I spend my time versus where the other council members spend their time. Yep. Obviously, there's quite a lot of people to meet, both across government and in business, and making sure we do a good job of divide and conquer, leveraging the capability and skills we have across the council.
It sounds a ridiculously small amount of time. I mean, is that your view?
Well, I have quite a busy day job too, so I have to balance this in line with everything else. I mean, so far there's peaks and troughs in that, I would say. Mm-hmm. You come up to this week, for example, is a peak, I would say, because we have a council member meeting. We have this. There was meetings with the Treasury yesterday, but. Overall, I'm managing within that time. I need to just make sure that we can do the job that we're being asked to do with that amount of time, and we don't. We're not. Time is not our enemy in a way in terms of the job that needs to get done. So I've managed it so far, but it's something I'm keeping a careful eye on.
Mr. Weston,
you have some impressive names also on the council. Were you involved in their appointment? And can I ask, are they also contracted to give up a similar number of days, 2 to 3 days a month?
Yes.
Or are some of them able to give more?
So contractually wise, it's all the same. Let me ask the first question first. I was involved in, they were Secretary of State appointed with agreement across Department of Business and Trade and Treasury with consultation number 10 for all of them. And then I was part of that process just after I was appointed, but they were ministerial appointed. They have the same number of hours as I've specified. There are some of them that are in full-time employment, acting CEOs of large organisations, and there are some of them that have different work arrangements it will be down to their choice as to how much time they give to this outside of the contracted hours that they have.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Edwards.
My apologies. Am I on another question now?
Well, we wanted just to get a view on how you manage conflict of interest. So obviously Microsoft is a pretty significant contractor to His Majesty's government, and you're going to be someone with P&L responsibilities and some pretty punchy growth targets at Microsoft. So how do you manage that conflict of interest?
As I was appointed, we managed the conflict of interest by moving me out of the CEO, the active P&L job. So I'm now President of Enterprise and Industry for Europe, Middle East and Africa, and I have removed myself completely from the day-to-day running of the UK.
Okay, so you're not asking for access to HMRC systems?
No, and actually when any of that previous engagement arises back up, I actively state I'm not doing it because of any perceived or real conflict of interest. So I manage it extremely carefully, and even when situations where I'm at an event where I'm there in the chair capacity, but people are really interested in the topic of AI. I try and keep the two things extremely separate where it pertains to any influence one way or another. And yeah, I take that very seriously because I don't ever want that to be the case.
Okay, thank you. That's on the record. As we draw up our recommendations to government about, for example, how the Industrial Strategy Council should evolve, what are the sorts of things that you think we should be considering?
I think the statutory part, I know both the previous panel and I've said that earlier on, but in terms of taking the lessons from the past that was asked earlier on, I think it's such an important one for the future industrial strategy and economic strategy for the country. We've had experience of quite a lot of change in government, and I think if you imagine that had been in place for over the last 5 years or whatever, I think we would have had a much stronger position that didn't keep swapping and changing. One of the things investors or businesses hate is change and uncertainty, and so I think making sure that we can demonstrate that the UK has hopefully both a stable government but also a consistent and predictable and stable industrial strategy, I think will be extremely important. So I would ask for your support with that. I think the other one that I mentioned earlier on is really about making sure that we get the support across the government and we don't get caught in the politics of one department versus another. We need cohesion across the departments in terms of what the growth agenda is and how can we be enabled to sort of push the departments on the things that we think will help unlock growth for the country. So that would be the two I would reinforce.
Okay, thank you very much. We might ask for an
and
office.
Maybe my time
we
too.
might ask for an office for you as well. Ms. Barclay, thank you very much indeed. That's been extremely illuminating. We appreciate it's early on in your tenure, but we're really grateful to you for coming to Parliament to set out some thoughts as we draw together our recommendations for government. That concludes this panel. Order.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Great, thank you very much. Order. Welcome to this third and final panel of our today's hearings into the government's new industrial strategy. Kate Bell, Jordan Cummins, thank you very much indeed for joining us and for your patience with us this afternoon as we run a little bit late. Jordan, maybe I could just start with you. We're asking this question to all of the panels. Do you think that the growth target the Prime Minister has set for this Parliament is achievable?
Well, thanks for having us. It's a good question. It's kind of like asking crystal ball stuff. I think it probably is, but let me just caveat with why I hesitated. So our overall forecast period, we're expecting growth to hit around 1.6% this year, but 1.5% next year. And beneath that, lots of the debate gets stuck on the top line rate for GDP growth, but the figure that we're kind of more interested in on a day-to-day basis is the business investment rate. And so we think it's about 2.4% this year, but we think it could be 2.1% next year. And so if we're trying to assess, as I heard you were talking to Clare Barclay about getting to kind of G7 competitiveness levels, so 3, 4, 5% over parliamentary term, that is going to be a big leap, and I think we should be honest about that. The only way to get to that top line level, getting to 3, 4, 5%, is to get the underlying business investment rate higher and faster. And so, do I think it's achievable? Yes. Do I think sometimes the debate focuses too much at the top and not enough necessarily at the business investment level below? Also yes. It's going to take a bit of a lift from government and business. I think that's important to say. It's doable, but I think we've got probably to go a little bit further, a little bit faster in the first kind of 2 years of this government to make it possible by year 3 and 4 before they move into election period.
Belle, what's your view on that?
Thanks for having us as well. I'm going to agree with Jordan that it's doable but ambitious. But I think the key factor for us is not just do we get that growth, but does it result in an increase in living standards? I think it's really important to remember that is part of the growth mission. It says it's intending to achieve an increase in living standards, and I hope that we're going to pay as much attention to that when we judge the success of this strategy, when we judge the success of the government's growth mission, as we do to that headline growth figure as well.
The metrics the Prime Minister has used have been achieved by every government since 1955. Have you got your own views at the TUC about what the correct metric should be in terms of raising living standards over the course of this Parliament?
I think we'd look at jobs. Firstly, we've thought about the metrics as it comes to the assessment of the industrial strategy, and an increase in quality jobs is very much a part of that, particularly in the sectors that we are talking about. I think jobs and living, there are a number of measures of living standards. I don't think this is the right place for a discussion about, is it real household disposable income? Is it one of the other measures that the ONS produces? But I do think we want to see them rising, and I think we should be ambitious on that, and as ambitious on living standards as we are on the growth target itself.
At some point, we presumably should set out a view about what those goals ought to be and how we judge success.
I think that's right. I think we are thinking about that hard when it comes to the context of the industrial strategy and what those metrics are. That, of course, is not the government's whole growth strategy. Right. So we haven't thought of the living standards target as a direct consequence of that. We've thought of the intermediate part. Jordan talked about, the input of business investment. We're talking about, if you like, one of the outputs, but also a driver of that growth, which is an increase in good quality jobs.
Thank you. Matt Weston.
The government's announced a whole raft of reforms to help drive growth. Which do you think are actually going to accelerate growth, and which do you think might hold back growth? Kate, let's start with you.
I think we're very positive about increasing the investment rate. Jordan talked about the importance of public and private investment, and I think the greater enabled to borrow to invest that was announced at the budget is highly positive in that regard. We see the reforms to make work pay as a critical part of the government's growth strategy. We have had a low skill, low investment in people, low productivity growth model for the last decade or potentially more, and we think driving up the quality of work is a critical part of the government's growth strategy and of achieving that target on living standards as well. I think we've seen good signs on investment in skills. We're getting the establishment of Skills England. I think that's an area where we really need to go further. And again, we know that there is attention being paid to the kind of energy framework within the UK. We think we need a greater focus on industrial energy costs. I think there's an area of consensus about that across unions and business, but really tackling those issues which are coming up time and time again when we talk to particularly the foundation industries that will be important for the industrial strategy sector is a real priority for us. So that's not something the government has announced that is a barrier, but I think it's something where we think we're going to need some action from government quite soon.
Mr. Cummins?
So I think, biting off things like planning reform early in a parliament is brave. I think government deserves credit for that. This is a really multifaceted. It spans local, it spans parish councils, it spans central Whitehall. And so I think knowing that this will take a long time to get better, it was a good move to do it early because it could take the Chancellor and the Deputy Prime Minister some time to get that through. Linked to that, I guess you can't do big aviation capacity and rail networks and road investments unless you tackle some of those knottier planning things early doors. So I think if the government had jumped straight into this project is going to get greenlit without probably doing some of the underlying work on planning, you would probably have people like the CBI saying that's cart before the horse stuff. So I think that is probably quite smart. I think on Skills England, we'd love to see, as Kate says, a little bit more on the direction of travel in how it locks to the industrial strategy. So if we are planning an economy we want to be and we're building the bridge to get there, which is what this work should be doing, the investment in skills, the reforming of the levy, where we go to in the future on carving out new graduate schemes or apprenticeship schemes should be tied to those sectors where we know we're going to need a big slug of capacity. And so I think if Skills England are going to be biting that off, that is fantastic for us to see. Not clear yet, but I think the establishment of the unit is a good start. And then if I may, one more, I think the international picture is really important now. Lots of businesses after the budget are looking at where growth comes from. And so as we work through the industrial strategy, as Clare was saying before this, as they set up the structures, we shouldn't take our eye off the fact that trade deals and trading relationships and other sources of growth, which are important for our industrial strategy, have been talked about importantly by the Prime Minister, by the Foreign Secretary. There's an EU reset, there's rumours of ministerial visits to India. These are good things too. And so I think they're all kind of good mixture of policy and symbolism.
Thank you. Since the election, we've seen sort of a whole raft of announcements. The Stellantis closure, say at Luton, then most recently the AstraZeneca decision in Liverpool, and then some difficulties that Harland and Wolff have been experiencing over in Belfast. Do you see that as sort of indicative of a wider malaise in the UK economy, or do you think these are just one-offs?
I think we see it as a consequence of the lack of planning and a lack of an industrial strategy that was actually delivered over the last decade. There are different issues in each of those sectors, very, very difficult for the workers involved in all of them, important to say. But when it comes to Stellantis, for example, we know that is a company which has chosen to invest in a model which is taking higher profits and closing what is actually still a functional plant which could be delivering electric vehicles. We know some of the issues at Harland and Wolff have been raised for a long time. I think Antonia raised Grangemouth earlier, again a lack of long-term planning. Now, the industrial strategy cannot fix all those problems looking backwards, but I think it is important to say that some of the success of the industrial strategy is going to be judged on: does it give government the space? Does it give it the powers to intervene in these sectors when, decisions may have been taken previously? And does it give us a framework to plan for where we can see these problems coming down the line? Unions will have seen these issues coming and have an approach that actually works. So one of the things we are pushing for as kind of an output maybe of the industrial strategy is that every growth sector has a jobs and skills plan, which looks forward to every growth sector has a plan for jobs and skills, which looks forward to the future challenges, which, as Jordan was talking about, assesses the skills needs and thinks about when, we do know there may be transitions, where there may be kind of bumps in the investment road, how the sector as a whole and how government can support it to deal with those jobs and to make sure those workers either get their jobs saved, or there is a long-term plan to transition them into new growing sectors on equivalent terms and conditions.
Mr. Cummins, just turning to you, when you're talking to businesses and investors, what sort of feedback do you get from them in terms of their view on the UK's relative strengths and weaknesses to invest here, but also in terms of to scale up?
I'm glad you split those out. I think they are two different parts of investment, and then once the money's here, scaling is a different challenge. So I think if you speak to big global investors in some of our industrial base, they will say that the things that has always attracted them to the UK, stability of regulation, gold standard corporate governance, the rule of law, the time zone, things that everyone knows are kind of good barometers of whether or not you would put money here, still are really important. So we shouldn't take them for granted.
They've not been damaged, you don't think?
There are some areas probably where I think on regulation, which we should come back to, the cost of compliance is particularly high. So I think we should come back to that. Where I think investors obviously have been over-indexing on interest is the stability point. Think about the UK government for the last few years. They really need to know that broadly the cabinet is still going to be the cabinet in 2 or 3 years. They broadly need to know the strategy that comes out in June time from Clare and the team is still going to be the strategy in 2 or 3 years. That level of foresight don't take for granted. I think those boring building blocks are very important to investors. But also on the people side, and I think Kate's points are really bang on there. People need to know that if they're going to put 5, 10, 20 billion pounds into the UK, they will have the people, or at least the capability, to be able to sustain that investment over 5, 10 or 15 years, because this is their cycle. They're not tied to parliamentary terms. And so the skills plans and making sure that they have the pool of available talents is usually a really big consideration. Alongside that, when it comes to scaling, that kind of moves you into a new kind of how do I expand in the UK? What are the incentives around CapEx investments? What is the government helping me to do to make myself multi-site? If I invest in the UK, does the government have a good enough relationship for outflow if I then want to export something further on? All of these things start to come into play. Obviously, the scaling point is different if you're already in the UK and you're trying to get bigger, which is more of a financial consideration. But I think if you're looking at inward investors looking to move around or grow, they will want to couple the stability with a good sense that the UK has that kind of plan for how big its economy wants to get and how much it wants to change, so that they would know whether or not they could diversify in 5 or 10 years' time, so that they're not just investing in one thing that then goes out of favour in 2 parliamentary terms and they have to pull out again.
Follow that up. And we have a huge sector, correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of our financing base, with venture capitalists, private equity and so on. So why is there such a gap in this country?
Yeah, it's the million business question, I guess.
But I mean, we've been around the country,
okay,
talking to businesses up and down different parts, and they just say that no one's interested in talking to us.
Some of it, I mean, Kate might have you too. Some of it is, probably commercial risk appetite. Let's be honest. That goes in cycles. Lots of businesses tell us it feels quite tight at the minute to get commercial financing. Just the general risk appetite across the lenders. But also we have fantastic things like the British Business Bank that we have backed and we support, and the CBI's done a lot of work with them over the years. And the visibility just still remains quite low in our conversations with business. Not sure that they can help, not sure that they can help at the right time, not sure how to get to them. And so there is probably a role of visibility because we don't want public pounds to be unspent if they are there to help businesses grow. But usually the visibility doesn't help to get them into those institutions that actually will help them. The Office for Investment is another example. And so it's good that we are looking to bolster that through the industrial strategy. But Kate, I don't know if you've got thoughts.
I'm not an expert in company financing, but I do think there is a interesting relationship between the kind of desire for investment and businesses' willingness to invest their own money and corporate governance. So our view of the corporate governance regime is, although it has very high standards, it is very short-termist in the UK, and our corporate governance system encourages basically the payment of dividends, short-term horizons over investment. A stat here from my colleague that at the end of the 1980s, in 1987, business investment was around 4 times higher than dividends. Now they're at around parity. So we've had that shift to a much shorter term horizon for businesses in terms of their decision making. And I think there may be a cyclical relationship with that and the willingness of financial institutions to invest in those businesses for growth over the long term.
So we've always had a culture of short-termism in this country versus Japan or Germany. You're saying it's got even worse?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Antonia Vance.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I would like to draw the committee's attention to my declaration of interests in the register. So the government's Green Paper was published last October. What feedback have you had from your members about the government's proposals? Kate, first.
I think 3 kind of key areas where we're hearing from our members, basically, and I think they're there in the Green Paper, but they need to be brought out more. So one is just that importance of jobs. So great, we've got these sectors, but what's that going to mean for my members on the ground? How quickly will jobs be, how quickly will these plans result in jobs, and how can I see that visible connection between the government has said this is a priority growth sector, where are the apprenticeships, where are the jobs, where are the skills plans for people who work in that sector and people who want to work in that sector in the future as well. So that tangible connection to jobs as a good quality jobs as an output of it is a key piece of feedback. The second one I think I've mentioned is just when you ask kind of not for quick wins, but industrial energy costs keeps coming up basically as a major barrier. And that's very related to plans for our foundation industries. So I think certainly what our members would say, across members who represent them, is great that we've got these growth sectors, but we cannot deliver those growth sectors without plans for steel, without plans for basic chemicals, without plans for engineering, construction, ceramics, cement, freight, shipping. We need a really clear plan for those foundation industries, and that has to be seen as critical to actually delivering the industrial strategy's goals. Thank
you. And Jordan?
So I think to continue the rule of 3, I would say I think the doubling down on high growth sectors is really important. I think as a symbol,
so that again, doubling down on
those sectors where you think you'll get 5-10% growth over the parliamentary term. That is a symbol that we're taking this seriously, that we know how to prioritise. I think that's really important that government does that. At the same time, understanding that those enabling things that unlock kind of greater productivity gains, also very good. I think most businesses you talk to will say, yes, I need public policy help over here, but the things that are a real drag on my productivity are these few things. And actually, if government could work on those, sometimes they're not as attractive and they've been in the ether for a long time. That would actually help me immeasurably.
Like what?
Usually skills. So it would usually be all of my levy fund is tied up, or I've got too many regulations to comply with and I have to hire 50 people to do it, or those types of things. The slickness of the system in government sometimes, usually HMRC and processes around that come into that too. They're not always as attractive, but they need to be done for productivity gains. I should come back to workforce health because that's also a really important thing around inactivity. And then the third one, I think, is to Kate's point around foundational sectors. If you're a business looking at an industrial strategy and you're hoping that it is going to build that bridge for you into the economy we want to be, you've got to be really honest about the fact that there are lots of underpinning things that we need to have some action on, critical minerals being one, transport and logistics and infrastructure investment being some others. And so while they won't get the headline kind of life sciences, financial services type market-making press, usually these things will unlock a greater deal of productivity across the everyday economy. And that's absolutely critical. And those three things are probably the things that people are most happy to see.
Sonia Cumin.
Thank you, Chair. In the Green Paper, the government has put out that it would like to widely engage with all stakeholders, including businesses and unions. How do you feel like that's going at the moment? And I'll start with Jordan, if that's okay, and then go with Kate.
I think it's going pretty well. I would say if I split it into the outreach versus the kind of us trying to get information from government. So the outreach has been pretty good, I would say, from the Department of Business, from the Treasury, definitely in the run-up to the spending review, lots of kind of inbound on how does business feel about this, where can we go further on this. The areas where government rightly have to probably be a bit more guarded around the setting up of institutions, for example, like the Industrial Strategy Council, you kind of understand that you could go periods of time without learning what's going on because there's a statutory process and they've got to get terms of reference. And so I think on specifics, we've probably had less information, but not because we think they're holding something back, probably just because they're working on it. On the outreach from the Department of Business, they've actually been fantastic, I would say, from ministerial to PermSec all the way down. Broadly, if diaries allow, they will turn up and listen to industry say, we want this, we don't want that. And so I'd say it's gone pretty well so far. In fact, me and Clare sat down with the other business organisations yesterday afternoon, and that was a very good, productive meeting. And that's pretty much the whole of the economy that we cover between us and the Chamber and Make and everyone else. So if I was grading it, I'd say it's at a strong B+ at the moment.
Okay,
I'm not going to give it a grade. I think we're pleased that there is union representation on the Industrial Strategy Council. I'm representing the TUC, and we also have Roy Rickus from Community. That's something we think was important. I think we're very keen to see union representation on the sector bodies, councils that will accompany the growth sectors. And I was here when Charlie Mayfield was talking about the importance of those institutional, sectoral institutions having both union and business representation. I think across sort of the government institutions, there is still a bit of a way to go to remember that unions are equal stakeholders as businesses. I think that's just a sort of change in a way of working, and it is taking a while to feed through, but it is taking a while to feed through. And then I suppose the third thing I'd say is government has got a lot of plans at the moment. That is great. There is obviously a consultation on the Green Paper. There is the establishment of Skills England. There is a clean energy plan. There is an infrastructure strategy. I think sometimes it could be clearer to external stakeholders where these fit together and where the best place to influence actually is. And sometimes, are all these decisions going to be taken in the spending review? Should we actually all be talking to the Treasury, or where the points of influence are and where the plans are intended to fit together? Because there are normally fewer of us able to represent the voices of workers than there may be of the people making those plans.
Thank you.
Just going back to you, Jordan. You give us a B+ to the government. Is there any areas of difficulties or any area that you think, any barriers that you think your members or yourself would like to see broken down, and when it comes to communication?
I think on there's one main one. I think it's the understanding that there are multifaceted costs that are consistently going up for the cost of doing business. Not for any single fault, but energy cost is obviously one. I've spoken about regulation. There are some industries where this is a perpetually growing bill, and the cost of employment is going up. Whether we can do the rounds and make work pay, but the cost of employment is going up consistently. And so, rather than we don't need a big ideological debate about whether or not that is a good or bad thing. We just need an open forum for the understanding that any strategy that comes from now, including the spending review and the industrial strategy, does need to major on the fact that there are parts of the economy that are really struggling. And so it's easy for us to do outreach on high-growth sectors and the structure of the industrial strategy and some of those public policy documents. But when it comes to business to government communication, I think a bit more kind of cross-departmental, perhaps, leading with the briefing of saying, we understand that there are some areas that are quite tough for you at the moment, and therefore everything we say from now on is supposed to be to alleviate that rather than make it worse. And so that would be a comms addition that would be fantastic to hear.
Matt Weston.
Just interested to know what you think should be the right level of government investment through its spending review into the industrial strategy. We heard earlier about, under the Theresa May government, I think the figure was 42 billion. What are your thoughts, Mr. Cummins?
So the funny thing about this, spending reviews aren't...
Over 5 years, by the way, sorry.
Yeah. In all of my time of doing this, spending reviews haven't always been the natural territory for us to talk to government about growth measures. A lot of the time it is about envelope spending, things getting through the system. I think the government has been quite clear that this is going to be a different type of spending review in that sense, and they want to treat it very much like an economic stimulus type package, as well as kind of envelope management. Actual figures, I don't think we've done the modelling of what is a good amount of money. I think the government have said they want to unlock around £100 billion of investment, which is a big number. That would be a number that I'm sure we would get behind and businesses would like to see. But I think public investment in the UK is about 3% of GDP. And so we could probably have a debate about whether or not it should be 4 or 5% as a catalytic investment to get that private investment to come in behind it. In the EU, it's about 1%, for example, and they are really waking up to the fact that as a bloc they need to do more public investment to inspire that private investment. And so when we think about the numbers, we are interested in the figure, but we are more interested in the pound that the state puts in versus the pound that the private sector can then unlock. We're more interested in the intersection than the figure. But I think if the government puts 100 billion on it, that sounds like a pretty good big number from our perspective.
What sort of ratio would you think is right, though? Because that's what you're saying, is it,
yeah.
it is relative, sort of, and we heard from Professor Mazzucato talking about sort of catalysing private sector. So what do you think it should be as a ratio?
I mean, I would definitely give it a view that my economists would shout at me for, but if it's less than double, I think that is probably not a good use of money. So for every pound the state should spend, the private sector should be able to crowd in at least double that amount. And I think that would get us to start with the chair's question. If we're going to make 3, 4, 5%, there's only so many fiscal events we have in that time, and so there's only so much envelope we can deploy for the private sector to then spend a year or so working out whether or not it can then row in behind that pound and pence. And so, it probably should be for every pound you spend, the private sector can unlock a couple.
Ms. Bell?
I don't think I'm going to give a total figure, but I can give you some areas where we have specifically asked for more money and are looking for in the spending review. So those relate to rail infrastructure, an investment decision on Sizewell C, funding for the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, more funding for the Warm Home Plans. Now, you may see those as industrial strategy adjacent, but we think they are critical to delivering the infrastructure that is going to be needed to deliver across the industrial strategy. I think skills has to be a priority area for funding. You will know that the adult skills budget was cut by around 40% over the period of the last government. We know that 80% of the 2030 workforce are currently in work, so uplifting that skills budget has got to be a priority for expenditure. But then I'd probably slightly echo what Jordan was saying, but in a different way. I think we have to think about what commitments we can require from the private sector when it comes to that spending. So what are the conditionalities around investment in infrastructure when it comes to apprenticeships or the delivery of jobs? You know, we have a large number of tax credits, for example, supporting our growing creative industries. What do we expect for a return on that investment? We know we have very good return on investment from that spend, but how might we think about how government influences the future direction of growth, the outcome of that growth in terms of good quality jobs when it makes those spending commitments? And I think, you know, great to hear you say it should be double, but what does that, you know, what does that crowding in of investment actually deliver us in terms of good jobs as well as growth in the UK?
Let's come on to Charlie Maynard on this, because we need to develop this point. I mean, at the moment, you'll know the OBR projections are that public investment that's been announced is actually not crowding in private investment, it's crowding it out. So there's a really important question for us about the design of fiscal interventions.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to actually my earlier question, if that's all right. So I mean, you mentioned sectors really struggling, and a couple of weeks ago we had, I think, goods exports, manufacturing down by, I think, 11% in the last 8 years or something like that. So this is resulting in a lot of people losing their jobs. What I'm keen to understand is if we're serious about productivity and growth and talking economics here, and I'm going to go back to trading partners in Europe, single markets, customs union, and things beyond that, so not just those two, but I'd really like some straight answers as well on those two. Do you think that would help economic growth or not?
So, I mean, 500 million people on your doorstep, if you can trade to them more effectively and cheaper with less barriers, that will, of course, boost growth. I think that is a factual statement to make. As a non-politician, I can make that statement, of course. However, there are lots of political challenges in doing that, and you know that's your job. But absolutely, there is no doubt that our biggest potential trading partner is right next to us geographically, and so ease of access there would be hugely beneficial to British business.
So would you encourage a more ambitious reset when the Prime Minister meets President von der Leyen?
I think business would want. Business does want a bit of bravery. I think the word ambition is one word. I think a bit of bravery based on where we are. You know, the Foreign Secretary says the important thing about our foreign relations strategy is we take the world we're in as well as the one that we want. And I think that is important context. Ambition today probably looks a lot different from ambition 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. And so more than just can we sign an agreement, is it a customs or a non-customs union, what's possible and what's not possible, is that there is a public commitment to some kind of time frame for decisions. And I think business would want a reset approached in the way that they would approach a very knotty industrial problem. You sit down, you set a clear agenda, you define the parameters, and then you kind of publish your progress on those parameters, and you get through and then you make a statement at the end of it. And I think high ambition would be good from some sectors, but more than anything else, people want more transparency about what is in the art of the possible, I guess, from the reset.
Thank you. And Ms. Bell?
I think the government's been clear that its trade strategy is part of its growth strategy and that they need to be integrated together. I think obviously the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is an opportunity to do that. I don't think I can rate the government's level of ambition right now, but I think where...
My question, Ms. Bell, I was asking whether the question I asked Mr. Cummins was, do you think our economy will grow faster if we're inside the single market and customs and moving much faster towards Europe on things even before that, or not?
I don't know what's on the table for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement deal, and therefore I think the question is, how can we get our economy to grow faster? You know, we do know there are trade frictions at the moment. That's something our manufacturing businesses have talked about. It's something our creative industries have talked about in terms of, and that's clearly part of the growth sector.
Yes, but you don't have to answer the question if you don't want to, but let's just if we were, and I take your point completely, there's politics, so I get that. But if we were inside the single market and the customs union, would our economy grow faster or not?
Genuinely don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Let me just pick up this question about fiscal interventions. So some of the statistics that came out of the analysis of the Bidenomics programme suggested that perhaps $6 was being crowded in for every dollar of public investment. Quite difficult to pin down the analytical truth. to that. We've obviously got the OBR forecasts about private investment not necessarily being crowded in at the rate that we'd like over the course of this budget. Do you have a view about how you get the biggest bang for the buck when it comes to public investment, Mr. Cummins? Do you put the money in as capital spending? Do you put it in as tax credits? What's your kind of house view about the best design, the best mix of public spending?
If I'm honest, I probably don't have a perfect house view. I would say, I think tax credits plays quite an important role. Lots of our members would want to see more intervention in that space. However, I think what comes up more often than not is, in a kind of post-private finance initiative world, what is the kind of 2.0 model that people are latching onto for the big projects over this parliamentary term to start crowding in some of that money. And so whether or not it's assessing mutual investment funds, for example, that have been quite successful in infrastructure investment in Wales, where are the credentials of schemes that have popped up around the UK or in other jurisdictions that seem to be getting the money flowing in from the private sector faster? And I think it's that assessment of knowing the politics around PFI, knowing where we've been in the last 20 years around what's gone right and what's gone wrong. We've got to draw a line in the sand and work out what comes next for the UK. Okay. And I think those models.
If I give you £1 billion to run your own industrial strategy, give us a sense of where you'd spend the money.
So it'd probably be a mixture of big capital investment, something that unlocks big infrastructure, big jobs impetus. Yeah.
What sort of fraction of the billion I've just generously given you?
Probably a big chunk. I'd say probably at least a third, maybe half. Yeah. Big symbolic projects that lead to job creation, create supply chains, make markets. Mm-hmm. I'd probably want to spend a good amount of time on where you can create kind of sandbox type environments to create higher risk appetites, so we can push the appetite on that. We've done quite well in the past in some areas on that. Look at financial services innovation in the last kind of 10, 20 years. And then I think I would spend a good chunk of that money probably on skills development. I would probably spend quite a lot of money in the people space, not just for bums on seats in companies, but probably more for capability building in the transformation we need in some of those sectors that are struggling.
And how much of this money would you devolve, and how much would you spend through the well-oiled machine that is Whitehall?
Good question. I'd say our house view is that I probably can't give you a percentage, but I would devolve a good chunk. I think that is fair to say.
Okay. It's a good chunk. Half, two-thirds, 90%?
I maybe can't give the perfect amount of money.
What do you think, Kate Bell?
I think the priorities that Jordan set out probably, I've already expressed them. I think they are a shared set of priorities around infrastructure, skills, energy costs. I think it is really important to think about how you structure that funding and the conditionalities around it. A couple of examples. Hinkley Point C, there is a target that there will be one apprenticeship for every 8 trades workers on site. That's a clear example of a conditionality around that. Another example from Canada, their tax credits for clean energy projects require you get higher tax credit if you have 10% of the labour done by apprenticeship. So I think we are really interested in the structure of that funding and the strings attached that come with it. I don't want to give you a percentage for the devolution, because I think if you're building an infrastructure project, you are not going to devolve that funding. And, Jordan has just said quite a lot of that money we do need in pieces of national infrastructure which are going to benefit the whole country. I think there is a dilemma about skills funding. We are going to have local skills and growth plans, but I think we also do need skills plans at a sectoral level. So I can't give you a percentage, but I think that is a question that needs probably a bit more thought about where are we driving skills for sectors and transferable skills, and where are we driving skills for local areas. So I don't have a percentage answer, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Okay, Sarah Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. And I think that leads us quite nicely into the discussion around what do we think our institutions can be doing, and what do we mean when we talk about partnership. And I think earlier, Kate, you said you didn't feel like unions, for example, were necessarily at that even footing, rather. So it's going rather dangerously. And so I just wondered what you thought about what is it that's expected then from both businesses and trade unions of government, and what should government expect of that partnership between businesses and unions, sort of get these things to move, more effectively?
I think I've talked a bit about kind of the Industrial Strategy Council obviously does have union representation. I think there is a way to go before we are 100% clear about how exactly that's going to work, how its advice is going to be formalised, how government responds to that advice, and kind of the precise remit of what it can and can't make recommendations to government on, and how government responds to that. I think we've got, real learning from tripartite institutions that we have in the UK. The Low Pay Commission, probably our most successful institution, that for over 20 years has been making a recommendation about, the hardest thing in labour market policy, which is how much people are going to actually get paid, and doing so successfully. And I think some of the success of that has been balanced representation. It also has independent representation, a clear remit. Government asks it a question and it makes a recommendation to government on an annual basis. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. I think we do need the tripartite kind of approach, or even a bipartite approach at a sectoral level as well. I think we know when that works. We do have some sectoral architecture left in the UK. We have a construction industry training board, which has, managed to invest some additional money into construction skills. We have a retail sector council, which during the pandemic worked really closely together in terms of safety measures for workers and stores. So I think we need to look at that machinery, look at where it's working well, and learn from that in the growth sectors as well.
And Jordan, have you got any thoughts on the same?
Yeah, I'd agree. So I think some of the best examples usually come from COVID. Furlough is a fantastic example of the CBI and the TUC and government standing outside number 10 and making that work. However, the challenge is it can't just work under pressure. This has to feel like a partnership going forward. And I think the Low Pay Commission is a fantastic example. Usually what happens is to make this work, you need to roll the pitch a bit. And so if there are difficult decisions coming, or whether it's legislation or in public policy, in order for us to have a clear enough mandate to engage in tripartism, we just need the time. And so whether it's us or any other representative body, knowing the foresight point I made earlier is really, really important. And so when we talk about the transformation of industries, of which there will be multiple, whether or not we want it or not, it will just happen. In lots of those conversations, it's really important that the TUC and the CBI or any other organisation are doing it together, because it's the sunlight that can emerge between conversations, between rooms, that can sometimes slow you down. So the more we can do those transformation discussions together, the better.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cooper.
Just going to jump in on that point. Is there a tension here in that this growth strategy is picking, it's almost like Hunger Games, you're picking certain sectors and we're reinforcing success. We've heard earlier that we're looking at previous growth figures and we're picking the winners based on that. Now, there's an element, of course, of trying to look into the future and guess what's coming down the tracks. But is there not an inherent tension here that you may say, CBI may say, this industry is on the wane, it's a sunset industry, it's going? That then might not play too well with the TUC. So I'm thinking, for instance, of oil and gas. A lot of tension around oil and gas at the moment. Something like 200,000 jobs directly involved in oil and gas across the UK at the moment. Yes, there's a transition coming. We're in the foothills of that. There's no doubt about that. But there is an argument about how quickly we're going there and how quickly we're getting those people into those new jobs. Is there a tension here about picking these winners at this stage?
I mean, to answer your question, yes, there will always be tensions because these are inherently difficult discussions. And so I think oil and gas is a fantastic example. Some of our biggest oil and gas companies are some of the biggest investors in green technology at exactly the same time. The challenge of running a G7 nation is that you have to hold these things at once. And so I wouldn't imagine that everything that me and Kate we wouldn't agree on everything. But the important thing is we discuss it together. And so one of the challenges that we have if we don't make tripartism work is that you just get factions and that individual sectors or individual firms like Grangemouth, people just think that there's no coordination above them, and that can be quite dangerous, I think, for trust in this model that we have. And so I do agree with you, there will be tension sometimes, but that shouldn't detract from our ability to have this conversation together, even if we don't agree. Kate,
I probably do agree on that point. I mean, around oil and gas, our policy is no ban without a plan, and it's the lack of a plan that we're really talking about here. We think that those institutional frameworks are critical to getting those plans in place and to seeing the issues coming down the line. You know, the issues around Grangemouth, for example, incredibly evident to workers who actually work on that plant, and they haven't had anywhere to go to say, okay, you know, some financial difficulties, we can see waning demand, how are we transforming this site to do something different? What other jobs and skills or what investments are coming to this area? So it's that lack of a plan which has created the real tensions, because we don't get to talk about the issues until it's too late, until workers' jobs are on the line.
And if I may just add one more thing, just on definitely on the skills transition, honesty about what those skills looks like when you put the word green in them, I think is really important, because there are some sectors where green skills still look a lot like the jobs that have to happen right now, and I think that gets lost sometimes. I think there's sometimes an assumption that we can transition kind of sectors that are transforming, and that there are perfectly crafted future focused jobs ready to go into, which a lot of the time just won't be the case in any economy anywhere, and so that honesty is really important.
Briefly.
Just very briefly, were you surprised that, listening to Clare, Barclay earlier, that how much time is being devoted by the council to turning a supertanker around?
Didn't sound very much time to us. Hey, Bill?
I think I don't have a good metric for assessing what level of time should be taken at this stage.
The challenge is huge, isn't it, that we face?
It's a big challenge, but you know, the government has started on it. It's got a civil service which is obviously working on the industrial strategy itself. The role of the council is to advise on that strategy. Obviously, a particularly, you know, intense period of work up until the point when that strategy is published. But I do think, you know, as Clare, Barclay said, as everybody has said, the aim of that Industrial Strategy Council is to be here for the long term and to have that oversight and to provide some certainty over a long period of time. So I think that's the framework we should be looking at, you know, what is sustainable over the long time, as well as what it needs to do in this intense period before the white paper is actually published.
Mr. Cummins, were you pleased or surprised?
I wasn't massively surprised. You know, I think these are difficult decisions to make. New institutions, to put them on statutory footing, takes time. You think about what happened with the Climate Change Committee. You know, this is a highly respected institution now that government listens to, knows it has to listen to. That didn't happen overnight. And so yeah, I think it's the same as business investment. If you're investing in the long term, you can't do it in the first 100, 200 days. Sometimes it's just not possible. That being said, the closer we get to the spending review, I'm sure we will be pushing Clare and the team to go just a little bit faster.
Okay, thank you. Finally,
Great, thank you. Just to touch, I mean, you've talked a little bit as we've gone on, but what does success look like? I'm keen to engage with. So, in the previous government, we had 3 industrial strategies. So, I'd be keen to look at your view on what worked as part of that and what didn't. Perhaps start, Mr. Cummins, and then move on to Ms. Bill.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that will separate perhaps this industrial strategy from the last iteration will be that it's smaller and more usable, probably for more businesses, and we're not trying to spread a government pound to every part of the economy. You know, as Kate said, this isn't the entire growth plan, and so businesses want this to be choiceful. They want it to prioritise kind of where government should spend its money. And so if we come away from this at the end of the parliamentary term, people will have a good sense of what the calling card for investment in the UK is and what you can expect us to spend money on here industrially. That's a pretty good outcome, I think. If we come away from it and we have kind of less skills gaps, more jobs available into the sectors that we think are growing rather than ones that just necessarily exist in the economy, that's a good outcome. If people on the high street, importantly, can pick this up in June or the spring or whenever it comes out and can say, I get that I'm not growing at 10%, but I'm consistently growing at 2-3% and have been for 40 years. And so there is some degree of policy package in here that is of benefit to me to reduce some of those costs I was talking about earlier. That's a good KPI. And so some of them might not be big fancy things, but getting enough of the business community to pick this up and go, I can see how it benefits me, has to be of benefit to that business investment rate, because that will give them the confidence then to spend money.
I think we would say that an increase in quality jobs in the growth sectors is the absolute key metric for us. I do think more broadly we need an understanding of how it fits into the government's wider growth sector, and as Jordan said, what does the growth plan mean for a business on the high street, a business in hospitality and the people who work in them. And then I do think we should be thinking in 5 years' time, are we facing situations like Grangemouth? Are we facing situations like Stellantis? Or actually, have we managed to turn that round so that people in industries which are changing have certainty about jobs and certainty about their future? And I think that's why we care about this, and that's what we should be thinking about too.
That has been extremely thoughtful, intelligent and insightful. Thank you very much indeed for helping get our industrial strategy inquiry off to a flying start. We very much hope that we can stay in touch with you over the course of this inquiry as we deepen our evidence base and as we draw out recommendations to government. But that concludes this panel and that concludes this session. Order, order.